Good morning, afternoon, and evening to some of you. Welcome to today's webinar, Introduction to Sustainable Urban Freight Transport. This is the first webinar of the series of Ecologistics webinar hosted by ICLAI and partner organizations. ICLAI is the leading global network of 1,500 plus cities, towns, and regions committed to building a sustainable future. I hope you all can hear me clearly. If not, please do not hesitate to put a message in GoToWebinar chat box. You will be muted throughout the presentation, but you can always ask questions using the chat box option. I also want to inform that this webinar will be recorded. I am Himanshu. I work in the eco-mobility team at ICLAI World Secretariat based out of Bonn, Germany. Joining today, we have Ashish Rao. He is Deputy Director of ICLAI South Asia Secretariat and also works as lead representative for urban planning, sustainable transport, and green buildings related initiatives at ICLAI South Asia. Our second panelist is Ian Van Wright. He is director at Future City Logistics, an independent consultancy based out of London that works to create safer, cleaner, and more efficient freight and logistics. He spent 11 years working for Transport for London, where he managed the program encouraging operators and businesses to revise their delivery activity during the 2012 Olympic Games. Our third panelist is Partha Bosu. He's an expert in air quality management with more than 16 years of experience working in the multi-sectoral environment. He has worked with the Society of Indian Automobile Manufacturers, where he was part of the team that developed the computerized emission check system for vehicles in India, which remains in use, and designed and implemented training with various state pollution control boards. He also structured the country's first and only Green Freight India working group, which works to reduce emission from and improve the efficiency of freight trucks and include members from top private sector companies, think tanks, academia, industry associations, the Ministry of Heavy Industries, and Niti Aayog. For today, we will have two presentations, followed up by a panel discussion on this topic where our panelists would answer the raised question during the presentation. Now I would request Ashish to start his presentation, which then will be followed by Ian. Ashish.
Thank you, Himanshu. Pleasure to be here to be able to share this presentation on sustainable urban freight introduction. This presentation is, of course, linked to the work that we are doing across countries, but definitely in India, in the South Asian region. I'll take you through the slides, and if any of the participants has questions, please share them and we'll try and answer. If I can go to the first slide. I want to talk about the fact that the nationally determined commitments as observed by GIZ globally tell us that transport is an important and very relevant sector for emissions reductions globally. We see that 172 countries identify transport as an important source of emissions. We see that 14 of those countries specifically mention transport as GHG emissions reduction targets. We also see that 119 countries define mitigation actions in the transport sector. Sorry. But before we start, I think we would want to, because the introduction presentation, we would like to share with you some of the key terminologies that we focus on throughout this presentation. Firstly, talking about freight. Freight is mainly goods being transported in bulk through land, water, or air, basically economy in motion. If we talk about logistics, this is management of flow of things between origin and consumption to meet the needs of customers, industry, or enterprise. And then, of course, talking about urban freight transport, it's all movement of goods into, out of, or passing through urban areas. It might be made by non-motorized transport, light or heavy vehicles, rail, ferries, ships, etc. This includes service transport and demolition traffic, This includes shopping trips made by private households. This includes reverse logistics for waste removal and returns management, and includes service vans for maintenance and supply or removal of parts in cities. The slides seem to be jumping, but let's go back. Globally, transport is responsible for 23% of carbon emissions. Road transport is responsible for around 74% of these emissions. Forty percent of the emissions come from freight transport. And if we look at freight emissions, 74% of them come from road transport specifically. Right, so globally, transport is responsible for 23% of carbon emissions. Surface transport is responsible for 78% of carbon emissions from overall transport sector, and freight transport is responsible for 40% of transport emissions. This includes surface, sea, and air. Transport remains the sector with growing GHG emissions. And in EU, for example, freight transport contributes to 1/3 of emissions of the urban transport emissions. This sector, freight transport volume, is projected to be doubled by 2050. So it's a very important, crucial sector to focus on. Going further, we would like to highlight the way urban freight impacts urban life. Now, we know that freight and related transport contributes to 7 million deaths every year worldwide. The noise and vibration that it causes can disturb sleep. Heavy goods vehicles, which might be a very small percentage of traffic in urban areas, are involved in up to 18% of deaths of cyclists annually. 50% of the urban traffic increases in the years between 1998 to 2008 were due to heavy goods vehicle traffic. It's definitely more damaging to road surfaces in urban areas. And yes, it contributes to around 21% of emissions from road transport. This is data from UK. And though it then, the urban freight poses challenges, there are also opportunities that one can harness by impacting this particular sector. We can look at benefits in terms of urban space for people. We can look at reduced air and noise pollution. We can look at reduced accidents, having safer streets. We can look at having higher job opportunities, reduced traffic congestion, and reduced emissions. Ecologistics. ICLEI members plan, set rules, and provide infrastructure for transporting goods by giving priority to people-centered urban development, health, safety, and low emissions. They promote circular and regional economies to limit the growth of freight transport. Ecologistics, this terminology that we use, promotes transportation of goods which minimize impacts on air quality, noise, health, injuries and fatalities, congestion, and also reduces GHG emissions. Our vision is to integrate strategies for passenger and freight transport. Now, with this approach that we are using for ecologistics, focusing on the ASIF strategy, you can see that there are a number of actions that can be taken when we are talking about avoiding, shifting, or improving freight. Using this approach of avoiding, shifting, or improving freight, we are currently in the process of implementing this project, which is spanning since end of 2017 to 2021, focused in the countries of Argentina, Colombia, and India. The project is called Ecologistics, Low Carbon Freight for Sustainable Cities, and is supported by the Federal Ministry of Environment, Nature Conservation, and Nuclear Safety, Germany, through the International Climate Initiative. It aims to capacitate government and non-government actors in these geographical locations to build strategies and policies to promote low carbon and more sustainable urban freight. We in South Asia are focusing in the Indian region, cities of Simla, Panaji, and Cochin. This is just to give you a glimpse of what the cities that are covered in this project are like. We are looking at Cochin, which is a coastal city, a large city, and a port city, has a large amount of movement that is moving towards the freight, towards the port, originating from around areas all over India and destined to the port, or coming from the port and destined to the rest of the country, passing through Cochin city. We are also working in the city of Panaji, which is close to the coast, but not a coastal city. Majority of freight movement that's happening in Panaji is because of it being a tourist and commercial city. Most of the freight movement happening is destined for the city or use near about. The third city that we are working in is Shimla. This is a hill city, state capital of one of the Indian provinces. Part of the freight movement that's happening in this city is because of passing traffic, but majority of the traffic is destined traffic for Shimla. A little bit more about the kind of freight movement patterns that we have in these cities. Around 34% of the freight vehicles in Simla are external to external movements, so passing by the city. It's regional movement that's happening. In Cochin, around 78% of the freight vehicles are originating or terminating in the city of Cochin, mainly because of movement through the port areas. Freight movement in Panaji is majorly because of the prominent tourism and commercial character of this city. A little bit about how we are implementing this project and what are the kind of outputs that one is expecting of the engagement that we have in these three cities, of course, other cities around the world. We're looking at a number of outputs. We are looking at developing a freight profile. Especially in India, we have very little information understanding of how freight movement happens in urban areas. So one of the first tasks that we do is to develop a city freight profile, based on which we, over time try and develop an action plan, a low carbon action plan for freight management in the cities that we engage in. Using the plan and through engagement with various stakeholders, we identify demonstration projects that would then be used to show to the city and the active stakeholders actions that are implementable and result oriented. We also use the plan to develop future scenarios for future action in terms of kind of impacts that one can expect, and focus also on informing national policy discussions around logistics and freight in the urban areas. A final output, of course, of the work across the cities around the world is to look at developing a handbook which informs various decision makers at the city level about the kind of activities that should be focused on and the kind of impacts that are expected of the actions taken through work done on logistics sector in urban areas. Till now, since the launch of the project, we've had engaging discussions in India. We've had national level discussions where we have had stakeholders come in from the Ministry of Environment and Forests, Ministry of Commerce and Urban Development join us to share their expectations of this kind of an engagement at the city level. Also through discussions, particularly with the municipal corporations, municipal agencies in the cities that we are working in, we have tried to understand what are the priority areas that we can work on through this project. We also engaged in a number of outreach activities like presenting during the Urban Mobility India conference, focusing on freight. And that's where we are right now. We are currently in the process of finalizing our baseline assessment, which is also including stakeholder analysis, establishing stakeholder working groups, and developing a calculation of emissions from the urban freight sector. Basis which we carry out the other activities under the project, which you can see as part of this slide. So this is all that I would have to share for now about our activities under the Ecologistics project. I think I would invite Himanshu to come back and lead us through the next actions in the webinar.
Yeah, thank you, Ashish. Thank you very much for your presentation, and sorry to all of you for this technical glitch of slide skipping. But there are some things which is not in our hand. Thank you again. Now I would like Ian to present his presentation. Ian.
Good morning. Just put up the screen.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's not full. Sorry,
No.
Ian. We cannot send. Yeah, full screen.
Okay. Do you want to go back and come back in?
Sorry, Ian. I think you need to do the full screen.
Okay.
Okay. I think go in slideshow.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Great.
Sorry about that. Good morning. Thank you, Ashish. Thank you, Himanshu. Why am I speaking to you? Probably is the first question that people have. I'm working with Smart Freight Centre, who are a leading not-for-profit organisation focusing on carbon reduction. And while they're particularly working with businesses and industry, the important thing they've recognised is that if they're going to deal with carbon reduction across the globe from these large multinational companies, they need to think about who else is engaged and how to work in urban areas. So while most of the freight and the bulk of the freight may be carried long distances, it's about how you get that last mile, as it often is called, to the 50% of the world's population that live in urban areas. And my background is having worked 18 years in logistics, is having spent 10 years at Transport for London, and now working with cities around the globe about how to manage sustainable urban freight. So, excuse me, the main issue is really, what do we need to think about? How can we start to access freight and manage it in a way that is beneficial to a city? It means we've got to understand something about how it functions, why it's there, and how we can actually change things. So as Ashish has mentioned, there is clearly an issue at the local level and at the national level to address CO2. But when you look at the city level, what becomes quite clear is that very often it's about the air quality side of it. So nitrous oxides, sulfur oxides, and particulate matters. And that's what's starting to drive sort of a growing urban agenda around air quality. So while CO2 is important, it's probably the influence of the bits where if you like, the citizens can actually feel it and smell it themselves that becomes most critical. The other sides of the issue are about safety. So Ashish mentioned cycle safety, but also the livability. Who wants to live next to a road that's got masses of traffic, particularly large freight vehicles? Which says there is also issues about congestion and not impacting the economy, and ideally improving the economy. So one of the first ways that a politician will often think about managing freight is to ban it. That doesn't improve the economy, and that's where we need to come out with understanding what the city wants, but also what the industry wants. So when we think about the urban freight itself, one of the problems that we have is understanding the complexity of it, because effectively 90% of it in urban areas is on the road network. It's using the public highway. It's a range of different commodities, different destinations, specialist fleet. You don't transport cement in the same vehicle that you transport medical supplies. You wouldn't do it. And it's understanding the complexity of it, when in theory, it may only be a very small percentage of the traffic in the urban area, usually 15 to 20%. It's delivering and servicing. And the important thing is it's commercial activity, that the majority of freight on the road is basically you and I as customers influencing that behavior. We're buying goods and services, and that is what is driving the vehicles. So that customer choice is changing. It's changing particularly due to the growth of the internet, but it's also changing because of the increasing urbanization and commercial output that people have themselves. People have more money to spend on things, whether that's things for the house, whether it's food, improved standards of living. So that change is driven by retailers particularly trying to encourage more purchases. It's done by cheaper prices. The classic is sort of free delivery on things. And the customer has an immense amount of choice. When you think about the delivery company that's involved, when we buy goods and services in a shop, in a restaurant or online, we don't think about who's delivering it. We usually think about what are we buying. So those commodities, it's about what is essential to move, what is a choice to move. So when people say, I've got free delivery, I want a delivery within 2 hours or next day delivery, the question is it essential? Food, medical supplies, yes. New clothing, maybe not. So different vehicles will have different rules. You'll often have a different rule for the heaviest of vehicles, like in the picture below. But 90% of logistics fleets are actually less than 6 vehicles. It is usually individual operators who are subcontracted from large operators doing work on their behalf. And the ability to influence that really comes down to price. So when we look at what is the makeup of a city's traffic in terms of freight, these are figures from London, and apologies for that, but I think one of the issues here is about how much data people have locally, and I'll come back to that. So The difference between the trucks and the vans, so vans are classified at below 3.5 tons maximum gross weight. And if you look at the all-day figure, it's about 16–17%. In central London, say about 16–17%. So when you look at the peak time coming into central London between 8 and 9 in the morning, it suddenly rockets up to nearer to 30%. And that's driven by the demand of what is moving and where it's moving to. So the issue here is that central London peak in the morning peak. And that's when people are trying to get to work, it's when kids are trying to get to school. So we need to think about why is it moving when it's moving. When you look at what's in the vehicle, what we found by surveying in London was that in that central London area, 47% of trucks in that peak time were construction related. And that's basically because the planning conditions says that you can't start construction until 8 o'clock in the morning because it's noisy. So it makes sense, but you start to say, well, how do I influence planning conditions to change construction activity? When you look at the vans, we found that nearly 40% were basically white vans. They were vans that we didn't know what was in them. We couldn't tell what was in them. And then when you look at the fact that the other two big sectors are servicing and facilities and construction related, you realize that there's probably a whole series of sort of subcategory of things that we would regard as freight moving around the city, whether it's things like materials for a plumber or a carpenter, electrical supplies, installation of satellite dishes, a whole range of things. And what we'd identified was that the growth of trucks and vans was going to be very much at the van sector. And while people will often complain about e-commerce, and a lot of the articles at the moment are saying that the internet is driving all this van growth, there's actually been work done in the UK. It says probably only 10% of van growth is e-commerce. It's actually the service vehicles that people need to think about. That will be different dependent on the local economies. And what the demand is driven by in those local economies, whether it's a port, whether it's an urban area through central business district, etc. But it's worth considering. Another thing to consider is the range of stakeholders. When you look at an urban street, this happens to be Barcelona, but it could be anywhere. You have to think about the businesses that are actually ordering the freight. You have to think about the operators and the carriers who are moving that freight to and from those businesses. But who else is involved? The local residents, who will often live above the shops or the businesses. Interested parties, citizens, trade groups, unions. There are other people that have a view of what should happen and when it should happen and where it should happen. And when the city tries to regulate that, it is often that. It is a sign on a lamppost, on a building, or it is some regulation that's been put in place, and we want everybody who's on the street to suddenly know that that's important. So the important thing there is about how it's enforced, how the regulators and enforcement authorities will actually manage that regulation. Other people involved, academics, have often got a lot of information. They're starting to study this area in great detail, and that's worth considering. Another thing that's worth considering is technology is often sold as the next solution. The issue with freight is there's no one solution. There will never be one solution, unfortunately, which makes it interesting for me and probably difficult for anybody who's new to the area. Technology will solve a lot of things, but what we've identified in London was that with Uber coming, whilst as a customer, that's great. You get a taxi a lot quicker. You can get a taxi in different parts of London rather than just in the centre. It actually increased the number of taxis by 80% in 10 years from 2007 to 2017. So that becomes a challenge for the city to deal with, which needs considering. And I talked about data earlier, and the issue with data is while big data can help, the issue is what's the question? There's no point in collecting data for the sake of data. It's about what question are we trying to answer? How many vehicles are moving? What's in them? Where are they going? But there's huge potential in technology about improving safety, visibility, capacity, fuel, so to electric vehicles. And a city may try and encourage that, but I think it's important that it says some of that will go by the pace of the market. Any investment in technology in terms of smart cities, routing apps and things can also be a positive. So when we look at, with all of those issues, what are the trends and how are cities dealing with it? And I'm working with cities, as I say, I've talked to cities like Stockholm, Paris, Barcelona, New York. People are looking at a range of different issues, but I'll talk you through London because that's what I know best. And important thing to understand was it's been a journey. It is not a simple, we'll put something in place and forget about it. It's a sort of iterative process. So in 2003, the process was begun with engagement and complex projects were developed, which was really sort of TfL talking to itself. And it was only when the Olympics came in 2012 that we had to do a program talking to the industry and getting them to change behavior. And that's where the engagement element and who you need to talk to and how you change behavior really came through to the organization. So by working on that and focusing on the things that mattered to the mayor, so to the politician, which in London's case was actually cycle safety, originally, but in 2013, cycle safety became the dominant issue in London, in transport in London, not just on freight. So we focused the programs on the safety element. When the new mayor was elected in 2016, it was readjusted to focus on air quality because that's what he wanted to say. And we've now got new strategies in terms of the land use plan and the transport strategy that basically are now accommodating the freight program that we put in place. So the politicians are incredibly important in this. When I look across the cities around the world, there's probably a very simple process to think about at the top level. There needs to be some sort of strategy that links the land use and transport together and looks at movement of people and goods, which is, as Ashley said, what Eclair are trying to do with this project. The solutions to that, people often talk about consolidation, they'll talk about safer vehicles, whatever. But those 9 solutions, these sort of 9 broad boxes really fit under these 3 headings. And it's a bit of a hierarchy, because if you minimize the number of road freight trips that you need to carry the volume, and then you match the demand to the location on the network and at the curbside, and then mitigate the impact, you will have more impact. Because a safer vehicle is one that's not on the road in the first place. A cleaner and quieter vehicle is one that's not on the road at a time that's important for the resident. So effectively, you get more change by moving up that ladder. How do you do it? Well, the issue is it's a balanced approach. You can deliver a whole series of best practice, case studies, etc. And you can deliver regulation. But it's about a balance and how you balance between those 2 areas. So when you look at the balance, regulations are perhaps the easiest way to change behavior. But as I said earlier, it's about enforcement as well. It's about reviewing the existing regulations. I mentioned London's planning control and the conflicts between those, as well as looking at new local and specific regulations, so such as clean air zones, new delivery bays, delivery loading zones, banning traffic in certain streets, etc. At the other end of the scale, you've got voluntary issues. You can look at talking to stakeholders, which, as I said, is incredibly important to understand that range of issues, promote best practice, etc. But there's also an area in the middle, which is sort of some form of incentives. When you look at procurement, public sector procurement is 12–13%. If all the public sector were procuring cleaner, safer vehicles through a policy option, that would start to make a real change. It starts to drive change and innovation in the sector. There are also issues about engineering and street design. So how curbsides are developed, if they exist at all, where you actually have safe loading zones against the areas where cycling or pedestrians are trying to walk. And in New York, they even actually paid retailers to change their physical shops so they could take overnight deliveries. It can be done if you've got the money. So the success factors, how do you make those work in reality? There needs to be some resources. Funding's great, but it's not usually there. It's critical there's actually staff who understand logistics and understand how to talk between the city and the operators, because otherwise they're talking different languages. Some leadership, and I think that's what this project is doing. It's providing initial thought process about what we need to deal with, how we deal with it. Engagement, I've mentioned stakeholders. Educating people, trying to make people understand what freight is and how they can. They don't want to have to think about the problem, they just need to know the solutions, and they need to know how they can make a change themselves. And we need to be not too restrictive. Freight will continue to change. 10 years ago, nobody was ordering anything online. People like Amazon hardly existed. Flexibility is crucial. And it was interesting. I did some work with Smart Freight Centre back in 2017, and we pulled together basically these 5 bullet points as what people need to do in thinking about urban freight plans. And I keep going back to this, and it still feels true today. So some sort of vision, land use and transport strategy with targets, coordinating across the city so that the operators know what they're doing and how to work. Collaboration, data, tools and modeling are great, but waiting for 3 years to do a data project isn't going to solve things. There's actually something that can be done today, which is about going out and talking to drivers, to operators, and saying, how can we change things locally? And there's a need for experimentation and flexibility. You may not get it right first time. That's not the problem. Paris has been doing projects on freight for at least sort of 20 years. They have probably one of the best freight plans there is because they've actually worked through things. So hopefully that gives you a start on some of the issues to consider and some of the ways of potentially achieving some change. So thank you very much. Over to you, Himanshu.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ian. Thank you for your presentation. It was really nice to know more about the policies and how these things are. So moving forward, I would thank you, Ashish, for giving this a start and tell us about the basic terminologies and negative impacts of urban freight transport and how to manage with avoid shift and improve methodology. Also about this wonderful project which is being implemented in India, Argentina, and Colombia. I would say all the best to that project. And Ian, thank you for pointing out the detailed freight movement in a city, from buying breads and doing online shopping. Also about involved stakeholders, so it's not just one transport operator, it's actually everyone is a part of this urban freight movement. Also the complexity of urban freight and the key policies, the takeaways from London about how to minimize negative impacts. As you rightly mentioned, that there is no one-time solution to solve the problems, rather it's a continuous process and it requires a holistic approach. We have a couple of questions from our audience. So the first question is, do you know for which type of services the service vehicles are needed?
Yeah. Just say who you want to pick it up, Himanshu. I assume me, but
sorry,
yep.
Ian?
Yep. So the servicing is really for a range of things. It's usually businesses. Everything from refitting a shop, repair of photocopiers, that side of things. There's also low-level construction, so domestic, residential, plumbing, such like. What we've also found is that as people, I think it's to do with people are becoming less used, particularly in Europe, to doing repairs and maintenance themselves. So people are increasingly sort of almost contracting out the servicing of their houses. Somebody will always come in to repair the boiler or a tap that leaks, and therefore you generate a vehicle with a guy with tools in the back. So it really does vary, and it's an area that very few people seem to have researched. So if there's any academics online, please feel free to research it.
Yeah, and I also assume services would also take this waste management or the waste removal part as well.
Potentially. I think the issue that we found was particularly servicing within the van community. The waste in the UK is basically a private issue, so it's down to private businesses contracting the waste themselves. Most of those vehicles tend to be over 3.5 tons, sort of 12 to 18 tons. And particularly the municipal waste collection for residents is all on big vehicles, big trucks.
Okay. The thing is, like, there are many questions right now, and I'm not very sure, but I would just open to all the panelists and see who wants to answer this. So many times the solutions offered rely on public sector, e.g., regulations, land use planning, etc. What happens when private investors are interested in coming up with solution without necessarily relying on political goodwill?
My view would be to talk to them and see how the political goodwill or the cities could actually help them. What most private businesses will do is do it for a reason that says they are increasing their own marketing, they're doing it for the good environmental reasons or whatever. And sometimes it would be a question that if the city would work with them, there will be it'd be a multiplier effect, because more people who know about it, they can promote it. And which company wouldn't like a bit of free promotion from a city? And what city wouldn't like somebody to do a free project in there, that improves the image of their city? There's a win-win there.
Okay. Partha, would you like to say something on this one, like how the private investors are interested in, if they have a solution, and how should they work with city?
Thanks, Himanshu, and thanks, Ian and Ashish, for this fantastic presentation. I was really impressed. Am I audible? I hope I am.
Yes.
Excellent. See, the thing is like this: the private investors come with both the solution as well as the problem. Jan talked about the Amazon, and the Amazon is a fantastic example of both of them, right? I mean, there was a time when there was nothing like this in home deliveries, and things like this never existed in India. And today, as and when the urban cities are getting more and more dense, and it becoming going out to shop and park your vehicles and bring your stuff back to the car and drive back with the huge parking bills, etc., people prefer to order. But look at this: that you have in a city like Delhi, which is not even is not even a state. We have nearly 100,000 motorcycle fleet delivering those goods of Amazon. And at the same time, Amazon is now facing problems because, as Jan said, somebody talked about next day delivery, and you have a problem with that. And Amazon is now encouraging people by saying that, okay, are you willing to delay your goods, and we, instead of next day delivery, we deliver it after a month or a week, and we pay you a 15 rupees or 20 rupees subsidy. In a way, what Amazon is doing, it is trying to encourage people to realize whether they're ordering something which is really essential to have a next day delivery, or they can choose to delay it for a moment. These things are very, very important. So how you bring the private sector into the part of the game, that's a very big factor where the government needs to come into the picture and bring them on board as partners.
Great. So this next question is about the cargo bikes. What do you think about cargo bikes? About the German policy to support heavy load cargo bikes more than 150 kgs? Jan, have you come across any examples in London about cargo bikes?
So certainly cargo bikes are increasingly seen as a viable solution for cities, and certainly e-cargo bikes, so ones effectively electric bikes powering them or additional sort of capacity on the vehicle seems to be an option. What I would say is they are part of a solution mix, but they are effectively a different type of vehicle. So they're a cleaner vehicle. They are not the solution in themselves. If you think about cities, port cities like Kochi or Hamburg or Antwerp, and you think about the volume of containers going through there, they're effectively all moving to people in the end. Cargo bikes are not going to deliver that volume. So it's about the right vehicle in the right area. So certainly in highly residential areas, in perhaps central business districts, there may be a good role for cargo bikes. When you are delivering to suburban areas or industrial estates, it's just not going to happen. So it's all about, as I said, it's sort of the right vehicle for the right area. But cities can encourage them, but perhaps not get too hung up on cargo bikes being the answer. If you go back, the cargo bikes are today's issue. 5 years ago, it was consolidation centres. You know, all solutions are good in the right area to the right conditions.
Yeah, so I think like what you mean to say exactly like that there has been, so there is a problem, and cargo bikes, of course, can take a very limited amount and limited type of material as well, right?
Mm-hmm. At
So,
very low capacity, you normally need 2 cargo bikes for 1 van. Because a van can take 3.5 tons. So if a cargo bike can take 1,500, you know, it's not even 2 vans. However, if you've got the local, they often need a local base as well. So it's about where those cargo bikes load and unload. There's a project currently in Berlin that's 5 cargo bike operators were operating at one site. It's quite interesting when you see what they're doing as operators, as opposed to what, you know, when you see what the guys are doing on the ground rather than what the operators say they're doing. So they're actually they're cooperating and consolidating between the bikes, and that probably has more benefit.
Ashish, do you have any examples in India about cargo bikes?
No, I'm not aware of use of cargo bikes as of now in India. Partha can add if I miss, but yes, bikes are being increasingly used, like Partha mentioned, for distribution of these e-commerce company goods across urban areas, and probably cargo bikes will be able to solve part of that requirement, that demand, but definitely, like Ian mentioned, it would have to be a mix that one would have to think of. Certain areas, certain demands, products like this would be very useful, but you will have to contextualize it to the demand.
Okay, so I think this would be one of maybe the solutions for your project to see.
Oh, sure.
So,
Yes.
Ian, there is a very particular question about. Sorry, you want to add something?
No, I was just saying that I just wanted to add a line
Yeah.
to Ashish. May I? Okay. Yeah. So the point here is that Himanshu, as Ashish said rightly, that actually the carbo bikes has not been very popular, but it has been a bit sectoral at certain points I've seen. For example, I still notice that there are some, the bread delivery guys and the milkmen, they still use cargo bikes in Calcutta. In Delhi, of course, they come in their cycles along with the milk cans. Similarly, when you talked about in the previous question, you talked about the private sector. And when we started this Green Freight India working group, one of the members was FedEx. And FedEx in his local distribution channel wanted to use for the last mile delivery, wanted to use cyclists as delivery people, So, yes, so probably when the private sector comes into the picture, they can also make a lot of things. But when it comes to a citywide, you also require a planning to encourage cyclists or cargo bike cyclists to use them properly in a safe and efficient manner.
Yeah, so just to add on this part, I think I would also like to hear your view on the e-commerce sector, which is like really rapidly growing in India. Do you
Right.
think like this private player, and also rightly Ian mentioned about Amazon? I mean, in India, I know about Amazon, Flipkart, and I guess there is everything you can buy now online. Like you can get bread, you can get fish, you can get chicken, you can get like literally everything online if you really want to. So what are
Correct.
your views on this growing e-commerce sector, and how would you see this transition? I mean, using cargo bikes or some other innovative solutions for this for cargo for e-commerce sector.
Right. That's a very valid question, Himanshu. In fact, I think that is exactly where I think data becomes very important for a mixed market like India. For our freight, we have such varied modes of transportation. So, right from cargo bikes to, I mean, the old school cargo bikes where they used to, they will cycle and deliver stuff in their back. Plus, apart from that, now the two-wheelers coming into the pictures. There are some scooties, there are some three-wheelers, there are tuk-tuks, there are sub-tonners which are like 1 ton and below, which delivers the perishables, etc. And they are of varied fuels. In fact, this section has grew like almost.
Sorry, I think we lost Partha. Okay, sorry, I think, hello?
Is in here. Do you want me to jump in?
Yeah, yeah, Ian, maybe you could just add into that.
So as Partha was saying, I think one of the issues is about how the city manages the plan to encourage the right vehicle in the right place. So cargo bikes in the city centre, for example. The issue about the e-commerce element is how, in a sense, if we worry too much about how people are ordering things, we will be behind the times, because Amazon, Alibaba, whoever are, since they're ahead of the game, they're retailers trying to sell products to people. Yes, we need to engage with them. We need to find out what their plans are. But what we need to be able to do is think, how are we managing the overall flow of freight into and out of the city? We think about, planners within the cities will think about how they are managing people movement. Should they put on a rapid bus transit to replace, to try and remove the amount of private cars with 1 or 2 people in them, or the number of people cycling, or whatever? And that will depend on the city's policy. But they don't tend to think about, shall I worry about people driving a particular type of car or a particular type of van? And should you worry about the difference between a tuk-tuk and a cargo bike and somebody just on a normal bike? Well, it's how you're enabling different styles and types of vehicle in different streets, and that becomes a very localized issue. It's not about how you set the policy overall. So the issue here is not to get obsessed about the vehicle size sometimes, or the type of vehicle, but actually, how we reduce the total number of freight vehicles coming in, how we make the whole thing a better, sustainable sort of overall system, rather than just managing one trip at a time.
Great. I think Partha is back and he would like to
Yeah.
finish his, yeah, sorry, please go on.
Yes, very sorry for the technical glitch here. So the reason I was saying that data is important because we don't have any policy. So every time the air pollution goes out of the rain in Delhi, the freight is banned. And the same thing, the same kind of restrictions percolate down to the even the smaller urban freight as well. Now you will look at many policies of different countries. If you look at what came out last year, the Singapore land transport policy, there is zero mention of logistics. There's no mention of logistics. So logistics somehow still misses the eyes of the policymakers. If you look at Tokyo, Tokyo is now trying to collaborate the last mile logistics with uh, public transport like metro. So I talked about this 100,000 plus people who are delivering goods every day to Delhiites. Now, this is one of the low hanging fruits, or this is probably the fruit in your lap to convert them to use electric vehicles, to convert them as electric vehicles. I mean, this is one of the easiest area. because apart from congestion, this is also a very severe pollution, because when it look at beyond the two-wheelers, the local LCVs, the light commercial vehicles, the three-wheelers, the tuk-tuk, these are all diesels. Most of them are diesels. The three-wheelers which are used for commercial purpose are diesel again. So these are very severe issues, and I think one of the best thing that can be done at the moment is to apply the ASF, which Ashish was talking about. And apart from shifting them to another modes, another thing is to shift their fuel and to make them electric.
Yeah. Since you talk about data, there is a question about how much a city needs to spend on collecting data and modeling for urban freight policies every year. Is there any estimate, like you can tell, for example, a city of a size of, I don't know, 1 million, how much they need to spend on collecting data?
It is not a question of spending money for collecting data. It is a question of first what kind of system that the city has. In many cases, there is absolutely no system or any registry of what kind of goods are being transported, how they are being transported, how many kilometers or VKT they are covering, etc., etc. If you do not have such kind of data, then obviously you have to start from a scratch and it can be expensive. But cities like Delhi, which has already a large amount of data of what are the kind of data points, what are the kind of transport points, what are the kind of exchange points for warehouses, etc., etc., it is hardly a matter of a few $100,000 for a government to spend over a period of 2 to 3 years and get some very beautiful infrastructure in place for capturing such data.
Okay. Ashish, I think you mentioned about baseline studies in your presentation. So, are you going ahead with such studies of collecting data?
Yes, thanks, Himanshu. We are in the process of initiating baseline studies in the 3 cities that we are working in. But I wanted to add to Partha's point that more than the money being available, it's also about the intent. When a city decides that they want to act on this sector, they want to take action on freight,
Absolutely.
you could start. You could start from putting information on where the freight moves, when the vehicle enters, when it exits, and you can build on it over time to take more concrete and definitive steps. But you could start small, and there's almost no cost that would be required to just begin thinking about how you would want to organize freight better in your city.
No, absolutely. I would just jump in here. Sorry, Himanshu. I mean, Ashish is bang on. I mean, this is 2019. We started discussing about green freight in India about 2009. It's 10 years. What has moved? Hardly. I mean, there is no interest, absolutely, and not only I mean, not with the policymakers alone. I'm also looking at the funders. I think ICLEI, I would like to congratulate ICLEI for taking this up and going ahead and starting this dialogue, initiating this dialogue. I mean, no one is working on freight at all. This is a fantastic initiative, guys.
Yeah.
So also just add very briefly on the data. So the data I showed on the slide about London, it did get checked by sort of a low-level consultancy project. But effectively, the first set of data we collected was 20 people that we recruited from around our office. We said we don't know what's coming into the congestion charge zone in any detail, and we identified from the traffic information that people had from managing the cameras which were the 10 busiest routes, and we got people stood out there on a street for 2 hours, and that was that simple. It didn't take a lot of data to start people going, actually we're potentially managing the wrong thing here by trying to manage e-commerce. What we said was, what's the biggest problem and what's occurring in that particular area? Data comes in all forms and qualities. You can start simple, is what I'm trying to say.
Thank you. Ian, I think we are running out of time, but I would like to take one more question maybe here from our audience. So how important is the role of recognition schemes in urban logistics?
To my mind, they are important in the sense that they accelerate the process. At the end of the day, people can only buy the vehicles that are available, and that depends on the manufacturers. Whether it's a local production for changing cargo bikes or something, or whether it's a Nissan or a Volvo or a DAF or whoever. A low emission zone, that type of element, clean air zones, start people having a conversation. Citizens are protesting in India, in the UK, in Europe, in North America about poor air quality. Those things start to influence because people then realize what they have to do as individuals. And what we said is a lot of the time people don't know what the impact of their purchasing decisions are. So they start the process, they accelerate the process, but there has to be enough time for the businesses, operators, freight operators to change their behavior.
Great. Sorry, Partha, there is a very quick question. What is Green Freight
Yes, please.
India? Could you tell about Green Freight India initiative a little bit, how you started and when it was started, and what is the current status of this?
Well, the Green Freight India used to be a national-based across organization body, which was hosted by the Ministry of um, Heavy Industries and Niti Aayog. We ran it for about a couple of years, around 2.5 years. Now it is in a more of a email group status. We are planning to revive it again. There was a meeting with the Niti Aayog to revive it. Well, what it does is that, I mean, you talked about the recognition program. So this is one of the things which it started doing, recognizing programs, doing recognition, doing awards, doing some pilots, and see some low-hanging fruits and what can be implemented in the Indian scenario. We hope to see it revived in another month or two's time, and then probably we'll give you a better update.
Okay, I think it would be a wonderful opportunity for you and Ashish to collaborate, because if there is something like Green Freight India and if there's an ecologistics project going on in India, why not take that opportunity to collaborate and work together? So I would like
Absolutely.
to thank you, every one of you, our panelists. Thank you very much, and our attendees for asking many questions. We are running out of time, and thank you very much. This webinar will be now available. We will send you emails about it. We will also send our panelist email IDs. If you have some very specific questions regarding to them, you can also ask them. Thank you very much once again.